Have you ever heard the phrase, the ends justifies the means? Most people believe that it was Nietzsche who said this, but he actually never said this phrase in his book, The Prince. Most likely it came from Ovid. But basically, this phrase, the ends justifies the means that when a result is so desirable, is so good, it is so beneficial, it is so necessary, that it permits the use of any actions. It permits the use of any means. It permits the use of anything that is necessary, even those things that are considered evil, in order to produce that result. It is the idea that once such a great result has been achieved, that it has been accomplished, all of the actions that were done in order to win that result would then be forgivable. This was the thought behind General Sherman during the Civil War. The South believed that war was a gentleman's activity. They believed that war comes with honor, that war was all about glory, and General Sherman wanted to show to them that war was ugly, that war was not something to be desired, that war is something that we should avoid at all cost. And so he engaged in something called the scorched earth tactics. Everywhere he went, he didn't worry about provisions. Instead, he took that provision from the land that he invaded. He took all of their crops, and whatever he could not use, whatever his army did not devour, he burned to the ground. He didn't leave anybody alive behind him because he wanted to teach his enemies that war was something to be avoided at all costs. To him, the end result of not being at war was so good that it forgave him of destroying the land of his enemy and depopulating it. What do you think? What do you think about this philosophy, the ends justifies the means? Do you think that there are certain end results that are so desirable, that you want so much, that it really does allow for you to do whatever is necessary to achieve those results? Well, our passage today will answer this question. We'll take a look at it in 3 different points. We'll take a look at how the ends justifies the means, and then we'll take a look at the means justifying the ends. And then finally, we'll see that God justifies the ends. The ends justifies the means justifies the ends, and God justifies the ends. We see that the ends justifying the means was the philosophy that motivated the Gibeonites in their deception of Israel. Israel had crossed the River Jordan after 40 years of wandering in the desert. They had come across Jericho, the great walled city, where they were told for 7 days to circle the city with their trumpets and sing praises, and on the 7th day to circle it 7 times. And the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, and they conquered that great city, a city that was considered inconquerable. And then they had attacked Ai. They had made a mistake. Achan had sinned and had kept some of the spoils of Jericho for himself. And so they found defeat in Ai. But once they repented and once they were forgiven, they attacked Ai and were victorious. And the news of their victory, the news of God's victory over these 2 cities, and the news of all that God had done in Egypt 40 years prior, had reached Canaan, and specifically had reached the Gibeonites. And when they heard all of this, they became afraid. God had taken a slave people, a people who had never had a nation of their own, a people who had only lived in servitude for the last 400 years and had conquered the greatest empire known at that time, Egypt, without a loss of a single life on the part of Israel, who walked away with spoils of war without ever bloodying their own hands. And after 40 years of wandering around in the desert with no training, with no specialties, no experience in war, the remaining generations were able to come into the land and to conquer Jordan. And so when the Gibeonites heard about all of these accomplishments, they were afraid. But they weren't just afraid because of what God had done up to that point. But they were afraid because news had also received them. They had also received news about what God had promised to the Israelites. God had promised in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and in chapter 20. We'll read from chapter 20. But in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. But you shall devote them to complete destruction: the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded. These were the nations that God listed who lived in the promised land at that time, that Israel were to conquer, that Israel were to take the cities of, that Israel were to commit to destruction: the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. If you notice, these were actually the same countries that were listed in the beginning of chapter 9. These countries that gathered together after hearing about all that God had done in the past. These countries which were divided before because of the great threat of Israel coming upon them had united together into a coalition to stand against Israel. But why were the Gibeonites afraid? Why should the Gibeonites have anything to worry about? Well, it's because the Gibeonites were part of the Hivite people. They were Hivites. And so after seeing what God had done according to his promise already to the city of Jericho and to the city of Ai, and as they were next in the march of Israel into the land of promise, they thought to themselves, if God had already accomplished this, surely God would accomplish all of his promises, and we're next on the list. This fear drove the Gibeonites to come up with a plan to deceive Israel into making a covenant with them. And this deception was cleverly devised to take advantage of a human weakness that is pretty much common to all of us, and that they were sure was present among the Israelites. The Gibeonites, as they prepared their deception, they posed as a people from a faraway country. As they introduced themselves to the Israelites, they kept on mentioning, no, we're from a very far country. We've traveled a very far distance. We've heard of everything that has happened, and our people and our leaders have sent us from this very far country to come and make peace with you. This implied that the reputation of Israel had spread far and wide, that as they had departed from the wilderness, as they had conquered Jericho and Ai, the news of all their victories had reached even to countries that are far away. And the Gibeonites also appealed to Israel by calling themselves servants. Every time they talked to Joshua, they emphasized again and again, we are your servants. We are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. Here Israel was, they have never possessed a land of their own. They've never had a government. They've never had rulers or kings. They've never had a nation. They were just a family group who had wandered in the wilderness for the last 40 years, who had had a couple of victories, and now other foreign nations were coming upon them, calling themselves the Israelites' servants, wanting to make peace with them. The Gibeonites were stroking the egos, the pride of the Israelites, the oldest weakness of all. And it was the pride of Israel that led the leaders to decide that their own wisdom was all that was needed. Scripture makes this clear. They did not ask counsel from the Lord. After all, didn't the Lord God appoint these leaders over such a great nation? After all, didn't God in years past use these leaders to accomplish His task, His work? After all, didn't the Spirit of the Lord descend upon Joshua to be the leader to take over after Moses? Surely they were capable of making these decisions on their own. And after all, didn't the leaders ask all the right questions? Didn't they do a thorough investigation? Joshua brought the delegation before him and asked all the necessary questions. Where did you come from? What people are you? And after all, didn't they thoroughly investigate all of the evidence that was presented to them? They looked at their provisions, their sandals, their clothing, their wineskins, and all of the evidence pointed to the reality that they were from a far country. And so they decided to make peace with them. Joshua made peace with them and made a covenant with them to let them live. And the leaders of the congregation swore to them. So at this point, the Gibeonites, who saw a result that was so desirable, the result to not be in the path of destruction, the path that God had laid for Israel, that result was so desirable that they would use any means necessary to achieve it, including deception, including lying. And it seems at this point that they are justified. Their deception worked. Israel was deceived. Israel made the covenant with the Gibeonites. So what would Israel do when they discovered that they were deceived? What would they do when they found out at the end of 3 days after they had made a covenant with them, they heard that they were their neighbors and that they lived among them? The Israelites were angry. They were justifiably angry, wouldn't you say? Who wouldn't be angry? The Israelites just got played. The Israelites were deceived, and conventional wisdom would dictate that any oath that is made under deception should be non-binding. You know, confessions that are signed under duress, are non-binding. If you force somebody to sign a confession, it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. Contracts that are signed under deception with all the information not being given to you are non-binding. So at this point, shouldn't Israel be justified in saying, well, you know, we made a covenant with you, but this covenant is non-binding. This covenant isn't worth the paper that it's written on. No, it's not literally written on paper. They should be justified in making that decision. But how was it that the leaders of Israel led the nation of Israel to? You see, it was the fear of God that drove the Gibeonites to deceive Israel. And it was the fear of God that would lead Israel to make a decision. For they knew that God had commanded Israel to always keep their oaths. He said this in Numbers chapter 30. He said it in Deuteronomy chapter 23. We'll read from Numbers. If a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his oath. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. They knew that. They knew that God had commanded them that if they make an oath, if they make a covenant, that they cannot break it. And they feared the consequences that would come if they disobeyed God. They feared what would come upon them, the wrath of God, if they broke the oath in violation of God's commands. This fear drove them to ignore the humiliation that they must have felt at being deceived. It drove them beyond the greed that they must have had for the land that they're missing, the cities, the 4 cities and the surrounding lands that they would now not be able to conquer, that they would not be able to fill and use. The fear of God had driven the Gibeonites to do whatever that they could to escape God's judgment, even to deceive the people of God. But the fear of God drove the Israelites to accept whatever consequences came for obedience to God, even if it meant their own humiliation and the loss of property. Whereas the Gibeonites were operating under the philosophy that the ends justifies the means. Here we see that Israel is operating underneath the philosophy that the means justifies the ends. But at this point, you might turn around and say, didn't God promise and command to Israel to possess all of the land? And the Gibeonites were part of the Hivites, part of the people that God had commanded, the cities that God had commanded to take. At this point, they could have very easily justified themselves by claiming one command was superior to the other, since God had commanded them to conquer the Hivites, and the Gibeonites were part of the Hivites, and they were deceived. Then they shouldn't honor the covenant that they made. That the command to conquer them overrid the command to honor all of their oaths and promises. They could very easily justify the desire to take and conquer all of the promised land. Justified breaking their oaths for that. You know, I've used this example often, but there was a famous pastor who pastored a church in Seattle called Mars Hill. And this pastor's name was Mark Driscoll. His church was, I believe, the largest church in Seattle, had been growing. He'd been preaching faithfully. And then he was kicked out of his own church. Why? Because Mark Driscoll had used the church's finances to purchase his own books. And you might turn around and be like, wait a minute, why would the pastor use the church's finances to purchase a bunch of his own books? That seems completely unjustified. But you see, Mark Driscoll thought that the content of his book, the gospel being presented in his book, was so necessary that people needed to hear it, that more and more people needed to hear it. And the higher that this book rose on the New York City's bestsellers list, the more exposure that it would have. And so he used his church's funds to raise his book on that list. That the end result of presenting the message in his book was so necessary that he decided to use his church's funds to buy a whole bunch of the books, to make it appear as if his book was more popular than it really was. It's not just Mark Driscoll that falls underneath this. So many of our modern churches fall into this danger that the desire to evangelize is so much greater that we would do anything necessary in order to do it. We don't have to look very far. The Crusades, the decimation of the native population here in America. All things justified because the ends was more desirable. But the leaders of Israel understood something that was very important. They understood that character matters. For every one of God's commands actually reflects his character. God said, "You shall have no other God before me." Why? Because God is one. God is the only God. God said, "You shall not make a graven image, an idol, and worship it." Why? Because God is spirit. He cannot be imaged. Every single one of his commandments is reflecting a character of God. You shall not commit adultery. Why? Because God is faithful. You shall not murder. Why? Because God is life. And you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Why? Because God is truth. They understood that. Before God had spoken any one of his commands, he prefaced his commandments by saying this: "I am the Lord your God." That is the justification for every one of his commandments. I am the Lord your God. Why should we keep our oaths? Because God is a covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. Jesus interprets this commandment this way. He says in Matthew 5, "I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than that comes from evil." Jesus was teaching that the law to keep your oaths wasn't about keeping oaths at all. It was about being a person who is always truthful, because God is truth. The way we do things matters. In fact, I would dare say that it matters most of all. That it is the most important thing. Not necessarily what we do, but how we do it. In our desire to obey God's commandments, if we fail to do it in a way that reflects his character, we fail to keep the commandment altogether. God says, give an offering, and you give it begrudgingly. Your offering doesn't matter. God would turn around and say your sacrifices are repugnant to him. But what about the conflict between these two commandments? That still hasn't solved it. Has God then broken his own promise? Well, let's take a look at it a little deeper. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, as he gave his promise, he says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, it is God who is clearing away the nations. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, it is God who is giving these nations over to Israel, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. They didn't fight the Gibeonites. God didn't hand them over to them in victory in war. So they didn't have to devote them to complete destruction. They willingly submitted themselves. And the Israelites knew this. That's why, when there was a conflict between these two commandments, that they chose to honor God's character. Because they knew that ultimately it is God who justifies the ends. And that's actually exactly what God does in this instance. He justifies the Israelites for fear of him and faith in his promises. It's actually pretty amazing. The 7 people groups, all of the nations of the Canaanite region of the Promised Land, had united together in a powerful coalition to fight against Israel. And because the Gibeonites abandoned this coalition, if you read in Joshua chapter 10, this caused a rift in the coalition. And the Amorites, only one of the 7 people groups, decided that they now must punish the Gibeonites. And so they departed from the coalition, the southern people, and they went and attacked the Gibeonites. And the Gibeonites, when they were under attack by the Amorites, called out to Joshua and the Israelites to honor the covenant that they had made, to come and protect them, to come and save them. And that's exactly what Joshua did. He marched his forces all through the night to come and attack the forces, the Amorite forces who were besieging the Gibeonite cities. And the Lord made a promise to Joshua, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you. And so now, Israel, instead of facing all 7 great nations together because of all that had happened, because of this Gibeonite deception, because of the covenant that they had made with them, God sovereignly planned so that Israel would defeat them in much smaller and divided groups. Israel came in and swept the Amorite forces, pursued them all throughout their cities, threw them in turmoil, and so they conquered those cities with ease. God had taken what looked like a curse to Israel, the curse of the shame of being deceived, the curse of losing the property, the curse of their endeavor which they thought had started well, and now this hiccup had happened. They took that. He took that curse and turned it into a blessing. He gave them an amazing victory. And what about the Gibeonites? weren't they cursed? Well, we see that many, many generations later, God is still honoring the covenant made with the Gibeonites. King Saul, when he became king, he didn't like the idea of the Gibeonites living among the Israelites. He looked upon them as foreigners. He thought, you know what? Now that I've had some victories over the other nations, it's time to clean house. It's time to go throughout the land of Israel and get rid of the people that we don't want here. And so he went and attacked the Gibeonites. And he slaughtered many of them. And God brought a famine upon the nation of Israel for 3 years. And when David sought the reason why, God said, because there's blood guilt on Saul. Because he put the Gibeonites to death. Because he broke the covenant which was made. And so David went to the Gibeonites and said, what can we do to make things right? The Gibeonites said, blood demands blood. And it was only after David had done what was necessary that God responded and he relented from the famine that had come across the land. God defended the covenant that was made, a covenant that was made in deception by a people who did not know him. He defended it many, many generations later. And what would eventually happen to the Gibeonites? God would continue to honor them throughout history. Do you know when the Ark of the Covenant was stolen by the Philistines? And the Philistines took it and put it, it's actually a really funny story if you get a chance to read it. They took it as tribute, put it before their temple of Dagon, and the statue, which was their god, kept on bowing down to the Ark of the Covenant. Every morning they would come in and the statue would fall down on its face before the Ark of the Covenant. They would set it right and they'd go out, and the next morning they'd come back in and the statue's bowing down again to the Ark of the Covenant. And a famine hit the land because of the Ark of the Covenant. And the Philistines said, you know what, we can't, your God is superior, you win. They put the Ark on a cart and sent it back. And where did this Ark, the presence of God, the mercy seat of God, where was it kept after it was returned? The men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the Ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. The men of Kiriath Jearim, one of the cities of the Gibeonites, they had the honor to keep the Ark of the Covenant. And the tabernacle, the house of the Lord, where was this kept? This was kept at Gibeon. And this would continue on until the Gibeonites had become a part of the covenant community. They would fall underneath the exile, the judgment of God to send Israel away. They'd be exiled along with all the other Israelites. And when God, in His mercy, brought the Israelites back into the promised land, they would be among those who returned with them. They were completely part of the covenant community at that point. He took what should have been a curse to the Gibeonite people. He took all of that, the shame, the servitude, and turned it into a blessing. But that's what God does. This is what He does all the time. He takes what looks like a bad result and makes it into the best thing for us. And this couldn't be any more true than in the death of His Son, Jesus Christ. Think about it. I remember sitting in a Bible study and we were talking about what creation would have been like, what the Garden of Eden would have been like. And one of the students posed this question: if only Adam had not sinned, if only Eve had not sinned, if only they had not eaten of the fruit, we would be so much better off. We would still be in the garden enjoying the best of all of God's creation. That when Adam and Eve disobeyed God and chose rebellion against Him instead of obedience to Him, when they sinned and fell and were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, the garden of God's delight, that was the very worst fate that could possibly happen to us. It was the worst curse that could fall upon us. But this paved the path for the birth of Jesus Christ, very God of God, into our world. Had we never sinned, and I'm not saying that's a possibility, but if we had never sinned, then Christ would never have stepped into our world. And after Christ came into our world and He lived on this earth for 30 years and He taught and He preached for 3 years and proclaimed Himself, proclaimed the kingdom of God, He died. What could be worse than the day that our Savior, our Lord, died? That sounds like failure. That sounds like defeat. That sounds like a curse. The cross which He died upon is the tree of curses. And He took it. He died and killed all of our sin within Himself. But He turned that curse into blessing too. Because He died, we died. All of our sin died. But He didn't stay dead. He rose again from the dead. He rose to new life. And because He rose to new life, we rise to new life as well. Christ took our greatest curse and turned it into our greatest blessing. And we are better off now than we ever could have been had Adam and Eve never sinned. For our righteousness back then would have depended upon our own obedience. At any moment, if we sinned, we would lose that blessing. You know, there is no forgiveness for angels. One sin, one disobedience, and they fall. And what do we have as a result of Christ's forgiveness for us? An unending supply of grace and mercy. There's nothing that we can do that would anger God so greatly that He would abandon His promise to us. That is the blessing which God gave from the curse. And you know, in order to accomplish this, He didn't take any shortcuts. When Jesus first started His ministry, Matthew chapter 4, He was tempted. He was tempted by Satan. And one of Satan's temptations basically amounts to this. You know, I know you came here upon this earth to win victory for all the people here. I know that they are in my hands right now. I'm going to give you a way out, Jesus. I'm going to give you the people you want. You don't have to die. You don't have to face the wrath of God. I'll give them to you. Just bow down to me. Satan gave Jesus a shortcut, and Jesus didn't take it. Jesus always lived according to the character of God, even to the point of willingly accepting his own death, even death on a cross, willing to even face separation from his Father, someone that he had enjoyed the blessings and favors of for all of eternity. He did it the right way. He did it because how we do it matters. Because he knew that in the end God would justify his obedience. He would justify it by justifying our sin in him. My brothers and sisters, we must live in the pursuit of God's character. We must live so that the means is more important than the ends. When we willingly submit ourselves to any outcome, if it means that we are obedient to the revealed character of God, that God will then turn our mourning into dancing. He turns our sorrows into joy. It's not the end result that we struggle so hard to work at, because it is God who will produce the end. We just need to make sure we're living in a right manner, a manner that is pleasing to God. So anything, everything that you do, whether you're studying right now, whether you're working, whether you're a parent, whether you're preparing for it, whether you're mourning or you're grieving or you're rejoicing, everything that you do right now, in this moment, do it in a manner that is pleasing to God. The means is more important, and God will justify the ends. If doing the right thing means a disadvantage for you, then you take that disadvantage willingly, knowing that it is more important that your life is lived in a manner that is worthy of the gospel than for you to seek after every advantage in your life, because God will then determine and justify the ends for you. Let our means justify the end. Let us stand tall and say, you know what? Yeah, I can denounce God, but I won't. And even if you throw me into this fire, I won't. And God is able to save me from this fire, but even if he doesn't, I won't. And I guarantee God will justify the ends for us by turning every curse, every disadvantage, every bad situation into blessing through his Son, Jesus Christ.